Welcome to this week's episode of the Pompey Politics podcast, where we look to gain insight into all the issues in the political landscape from Portsmouth and beyond. I'm your co-host, Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm the other host, Simon Sansbury. And today we're asking the questions of what if the future of the UK wasn't just decided in Westminster? So today we're diving into the government's paper on devolution that was released just before Christmas last year. A proposal that could decentralise power, reshape how we govern, and even change the UK political map. What does this mean for you, and where could it lead? And is it the end of democracy in Hampshire? So today we're joined by someone who actually knows what they're talking about, which is Graham Heaney. So welcome, Graham.
Hello, nice to see you. Welcome.
And a ringing endorsement, Graham, as somebody who knows what they're talking about.
Well, I'm slightly scared of that because there's a lot I don't know about what's going on, because I think we still have lots of gaps and unanswered questions about what the devolution white paper means and what some of the implications of it are. But as I teach local government for students, and I'm going to be giving a lecture in a few weeks' time, I felt I ought to gin up really clearly on this to find out what exactly the government are proposing. I'll try to get my head around it, but I suspect we'll be finding out more as we go on. And I might need to say something about that in a moment, depending on the questions.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Some of it is still cooking, is the technical term. So perhaps the logical place to start is what's the current situation? How are the current local and various other types of authorities in Portsmouth, in around Portsmouth, in our area? How do they work? How do they interact with each other? What happens now?
Okay, well, if I say a bit about Portsmouth area, because obviously that's the local concern, I'll say a little bit more about the wider local government landscape as it currently exists. In Portsmouth, we have Portsmouth City Council, which is described as a unitary council. What that means is basically Portsmouth runs all the local government services for Portsmouth and nobody else does. So we have complete control over our local government services. If you go out to Fareham or Havant or Gosport, you're in a slightly different situation, because those councils, Fareham, Havant and Gosport, are what we call district councils. So they don't have total control of all of their services. Some of the services are controlled by Hampshire County Council, which they sit in that area. So Hampshire controls the big stuff like education and social services. They also deal with strategic planning and things like that. But the borough councils will look after other things, like they'll run housing. They'll decide planning applications in their area. So planning is actually split between Hampshire and the boroughs, but they don't have the total control that we have in Portsmouth with all the services. So there's a split, and it's quite complicated. There's lots of different bits, but I'm just saying that's the broad way in which it works. If I say about the rest of the UK, the rest of the UK is really quite an interesting patchwork, because you have a place like Cornwall, which is a unitary council, but it's a county. So it controls all of the services within that. There are no district councils within Cornwall, but there may well be parish and town councils at an even smaller level. We have mayoral combined authorities in some parts of the country, which means you have an elected mayor who takes responsibility for some services, but the local councils still control a lot of the day-to-day service delivery. So if you think about the sort of map of local government, it's actually quite confusing to look at and try to work out, how does this all work? And to describe it is even more difficult, as I sometimes find when I'm talking to my overseas students. If they ask me, what's the local government system look like? And I explain it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Because to be honest, if you were designing a local government system, you probably wouldn't design it in exactly the way it is now. Our system has effectively evolved over time, and people have sort of built bits on and taken bits off and built bits on. So we've got quite a patchwork of local government. But in the Hampshire Portsmouth area, it's probably relatively simple. Unitary council, district councils, county council.
Yeah.
And I guess just we should think about our friends across the Solent. How does the Isle of Wight fit into that?
Well, the Isle of Wight geography is obviously an issue here. It's an island. So trying to tie it in with another local authority doesn't always make sense. So effectively, the Isle of Wight's always been a bit different, and it is actually its own unitary authority. As your little diagram which you've got up there shows. So the Isle of Wight, although it's a lot smaller than Hampshire, and probably not as big as some unitary authorities. It is in fact a unitary authority in its own right, but that's more to do with geography than anything else.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's interesting that there's kind of like I guess there's differences in geography that cause those differences, aren't there? And those different kind of levels of councils. I mean, as you say, that the kind of the graphic that we put up that I'll share later on, so that people can see it, and also people that are just listening to the podcast can actually see what it kind of looks like. It's interesting how kind of those splits of those different authorities, but you've got unitary authorities which control pretty much everything, and then you've got borough councils that only control certain things, and Hampshire but then also have those councils that have boroughs also have Hampshire County Council representation too, whereas Portsmouth doesn't, Southampton doesn't, the Isle of Wight doesn't. They don't have representation on Hampshire County Council. So that's kind of there's that multi-tiered kind of thing. Is that the nuts of it?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, the risk of complicating, I mean, the history was that we used to be under Hampshire County Council until 1996. From 1970 to 1996, we lost our social service and education services. They all went, we were effectively treated as a district council. But in 1996, our powers returned to us again, to become a unitary, which had been campaigned for, obviously, by people in cities. One of the implications of the changes in 74 was that a lot of the smaller cities, and I'm use that term advisedly, like Leicester, Nottingham, they became effectively district council. They lost powers because in those days, a lot of the thought was that having bigger services like education, social care, social services were so important and so big, it was better to have them in bigger authorities rather than having them done by smaller authorities. So there was an argument that size mattered. So it was better to take them to bigger authorities. Some of those ideas have now changed, of course.
As is always with business, the whole kind of with every business has gone through the sort of centralisation versus smaller agile setup. So it's no surprise that that's come to local government. And I know we'll come on more to the timeline as we get into it. But in broad terms, there was a sort of announcement literally in the week before Christmas about this being an opportunity. And then I think it was kind of January the 10th was the deadline for which there was the decision from all of our local authorities whether they wanted to opt in to be considered. Now, it's all happened at a bit of a rush with Christmas and New Year, and the most insightful local podcast were happily sat at home stuffing mince pies into our heads rather than poring over this. So in broad terms, because I think a lot of people have been almost guessing as to what it is and what it isn't. So what is being proposed?
The devolution white paper proposes two things, two slightly separate things, actually. One of them is the creation of mayoral authorities across areas of the UK which don't currently have them, which includes Hampshire.
Yeah.
And the other element of it is the local government reorganisation, which is about moving away from the two-tier system we currently have and creating a single-tier system across the country where there are all unitary authorities, effectively. Now, the devolution arrangements that existed prior to this didn't necessarily require local government reorganisation. It sometimes did happen because councils wanted to do it, but it wasn't a requirement. The surprise, I think, in the white paper was that the government actually said it's devolution to mayors, strategic authorities, but also there was a requirement to go in for local government reorganisation too, which is the slightly surprising bit, which caught everyone slightly by surprise and clearly has serious implications for all of us.
So I guess if we look at that kind of mayoral thing first, so is what's being proposed I think people understand the concept of the Mayor of London and obviously Andy Burnham, very high profile, sort of Manchester, these kind of big city conurbation mayors. So is what's being proposed a Mayor of Hampshire or a Mayor of Hampshire and the Isle of Wight? Is that kind of the broad direction?
It's Hampshire. It is Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. Yeah. I think what's behind this is, the government is committed to the idea they want to have a mechanism to create and bring about devolution. And the mechanism that exists is essentially the mayoral system, because it's been in existence for some years. Since 2010, we had more mayors, and these when George Osborne went in for his sort of Northern Powerhouse idea, he had this idea that there would be strategic mayors. They wouldn't be running day-to-day services, but they'd be running and making decisions around big key infrastructure, investment, public service reform, and that sort of stuff. And this is what the government have taken up. They've decided that rather than go on a deal by deal situation, they want to create a system across the rest of the country, because we've been doing this since 2010, and how many more years will it take? And I think they've decided they don't want to wait too long, because for them, devolution and being able to make decisions, key strategic decisions at a local level, is important for economic growth and public service efficiency and for improving local government. So they've put it all into this idea of having these elected mayors. I can tell you briefly what the sort of general areas of competence that an elected mayor would have in Hampshire. So it would be around transport and local infrastructure, skills and employment support, housing and strategic planning, economic development and regeneration, environment and climate change, health, wellbeing and public service reform, which is a new one, and public safety. So what that would mean was not that the mayor then controls the day-to-day services for all of that, but would cover the strategic planning for that, for all of those things. It would mean, for example, the police and crime commissioner would disappear and the mayor would take over the role of running the police and crime commissioner's functions, because it would seem silly to have a police and crime commissioner and a mayor. And so that's what will happen there.
Sorry. Carry on. Sorry.
I mean, they want to do this reasonably quickly. To create this strategic role, they're looking to have this developed, and with the view of having elections for the elected mayor in 2026, May 2026. So that's actually not a long time. So the first elections for an elected mayor would be in 2026.
Because that's
and the interesting thing that jumps out there, Graham, is that there are a couple of areas there that you spoke about. Like strategic planning,
yes,
where we, in our intro, we said, well, Hampshire County Council looks after strategic planning for the likes of Havant and Fareham and Gosport, but Portsmouth looks after its own strategic planning. So I guess, and maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but it feels like everyone moves to a two-tier system rather than collapsing it down to a one.
I mean, there's always been cooperation between Portsmouth and Hampshire in relation to our sort of overall strategic objectives. So when you're planning the sort of houses, what you want to have in terms of economic development, how many factories do you want, office space, when you want to put in a plan for how much you need to provide, you're going to talk to the neighbouring authority. In that case, it's Hampshire. And of course, the other thing to recognise is, I think, why they want to make this an overall overarching thing is because economic development and planning doesn't happen just within Portsmouth. There are impacts both outside. People move around, industry sets up wherever it wants to set up. So the idea of trying to plan this a bit more carefully across a wider area makes some sense. What they call, it's sometimes described as what they call functional economic areas, which is a bit of a mouthful, but that's what they mean. The functional economic area isn't Portsmouth, because people commute in and out of Portsmouth. They work in Portsmouth. Some live in Fareham. People come in for shopping into Portsmouth, or go and shop in Fareham or haven't. So there's lots of movement around. People don't respect the boundaries when they come to their economic activity or where they want to live. So that's the idea, that any planning around this and any funding and support for these things has to take a wider view than just one single local authority.
So how do you go about then defining that economic area? Because if you kind of think about Hampshire, the north of Hampshire is pretty much London centric, and the south of Hampshire is pretty much maritime and kind of the Solent kind of centric. How do you still try to lump those two very different things in together, or do you have some sort of dividing line? And if so, how do you draw it and where? Or is that the $64 million question?
It's not easy, and these things are just imaginary lines on maps. They try to define something that is in a sense indefinable. People will travel and shop in all sorts of different places, but we try to work out where the majority of it happens. And you define it. So, for example, you can say that the southern part of the Solent, sort of Hampshire, Fareham, Gosport through to Southampton, that is where the bulk of the population is, and a lot of the economic activity happens. So you could say that is an important economic area in itself. That's not to say that other parts of Hampshire aren't important, but they may, as you say, look to different directions. When you're the north of Hampshire, I would imagine Basingstoke looks more to London in its economic activity, because people tend to commute to London to live and work, and may well, you know, travel to London for, you know, leisure and shopping and that, whether they wouldn't necessarily travel to Portsmouth, you know. So there are those, but they are artificialised to an extent, and of course they do change, because as economic growth and development changes, then those boundaries will change. So it's not an exact science.
So I guess, without trying to draw you into the world of speculation, Graham, this all feels a bit kind of rushed. I don't think it was a manifesto pledge in terms of the government itself. Do you get a sense of what the burning platform is, and why there seems to be such an urgency to move this forward?
I think the detail probably wasn't in the manifesto, but the Labour government did actually say they were going to pursue devolution. They didn't spell out exactly how they were going to do it. I think there are probably at least two reasons why they want to do it. The first reason is because in order to promote economic growth, they can't have all of the key decisions about investment and reform taking place in Whitehall. So their idea is to move it out to these mayoral authorities, and then working with the unitary authorities to try and create the right sort of atmosphere to promote economic growth. I think that's key for them. I think the second thing, which hasn't probably been quite so highlighted, is the can I call it the crisis of local government, the funding of local government. Quite a number of local authorities have effectively become bankrupt, some because of poor decisions they've made, some because of the sheer pressure of service demand that has pushed them over the edge. I mean, Hampshire County Council is looking at a huge deficit. And I think the government sees the local government reform element of it as a way of trying to find efficiencies without having to put more money in the short term, because they can't. I mean, they don't have the spare cash to do it. So I suspect that's one of the motives behind it. I'm speculating a little bit there, but I suspect that's probably one of the reasons why the government reform has come forward.
So we've looked at the mayoral side of things. So we've got an overarching, you know, the sort of mayor overseeing everything. Now, in terms of, you know, our current landscape that we laid out has sort of, you know, four regions, if you like: the Isle of Wight, Portsmouth, Southampton, who govern themselves, and then, without wishing to be rude, everywhere else. What does this, you know, the local government reorganisation things, how do we think that might change?
Well, the government have said that they want to see more unitary authorities, and effectively to do away with the two-tier system. So getting rid of the government at county level, essentially, is what they're doing. County councils will no longer exist. So the question is, how do you then reorganise the existing areas and councils into something that's feasible, reasonable to manage? They've tended to pick on figures of population, and they've indicated that a figure around 500,000 is reasonable for a unitary authority. And again, this is not an exact science, but I did look back at some earlier work that was done by previous the Royal Commission in 66 to 69, the local government reforms of 72 to 74. And actually the sort of figures they're talking about are not totally out of line. Those figures were around 300,000 to 1 million, depending on what they were going to do. 500,000 is the figure the government have landed on. It's not an exact figure. And actually, I quickly had a look back at the white paper. They said actually they are open to some discussions about whether they will insist on that for every local authority. But as a guideline, without the detail of what they're proposing to put forward as a framework for deciding how you're going to change your local authority, that's the one we will probably need to work on. So 500,000 means that Portsmouth's got to be bigger than it currently is.
Yes.
The logic would be that we would expand and create a new unitary authority that would cover Gosport, Fareham, and Havant. Now, it didn't have to be those. It could be, you know, two of those, maybe three of those, maybe one of those. I don't know. There could be other configurations, but I suppose if you look at it if you took a map and you just looked at it, you might think, oh, that makes a reasonable size and location of local authority. So if I just use that as an assumption, that's what it would become. So we become a sort of Portsmouth, Havant, Gosport, and Fareham. Excuse me, I've got a cough. Sorry.
No worries. Just while you're doing that, obviously the numbers I had seen was sort of between 500k and I think up to sort of 1 million or 1.2 million, I think was the was the kind of top limit to that. And so when I was playing with the numbers, Portsmouth, actually it feels quite neat for us, because if you take on Gosport, Fareham, Havant and Waterlooville / Hayling Island, those kind of areas, you get to a very nice number. And obviously, if you move along to Southampton, Southampton takes on Eastleigh and sort of Fair Oak and those places, kind of up until you get to Fareham, you get two sort of kind of quite nice chunks. But then when you're trying to play with the rest of Hampshire, you sort of scratch your head and you look at the New Forest, which feels like, when we were talking about economic areas, that feels like that would probably be better off heading towards Dorset. And then you've sort of got Winchester, Petersfield upwards, then makes this sort of third rather disparate chunk to get to your sort of, and obviously the Isle of Wight, as we've touched on, probably looks to sit on its own. I mean, the other note, just playing with numbers, is that you can make an argument for east and west, with the sort of Portsmouth piece running up alongside the A3 until you get up to, towards Basingstoke, and the Southampton piece covering all of the, I always get my east and west wrong, but I think covering all of the western half, and actually ending up with only two authorities.
Yeah, I mean, what the government have asked the local authorities to do is to come up with some proposals for how we could do that. Rather than specify, they're saying, we want to do this. What shape would you like it to be, basically? And that's what the councils will be doing, I think, over the next month or two, is trying to come up with at least an outline proposal of what a new local authorities would look like, new unit authorities would look like in the Hampshire area. Again, it's always a thing about, where do you draw lines? I mean, Hampshire is the historic Hampshire. You could argue, why not ignore the historic Hampshire boundaries? But we're always, I suppose, tied by history. Hampshire is a historic county, and you could draw a line somewhere. So why not use the historic Hampshire? Because you could argue that you could go east to West Sussex, but these are all compromises to some extent, and not ideal. But I think there are a couple of options that you could do in terms of running a new set of unitary authorities around the boundaries. You suggested some, I've suggested some. So we'll have to see what comes out of the discussions, because I don't know where that's going to go just yet.
The various other existing kind of bodies, they scrambled to have loads of meetings just before the deadline. The Isle of Wight seemed to have a bit more of a drama with theirs, because they had a problem with their vote initially. It got quite feisty in their meeting, didn't it? But initially with their vote, they were told, I think, apparently that the cabinet who were proposing that basically they put their names forward for the early bird scheme, that they can't vote in it, and therefore the vote fell. When of course they needed to be able to vote, so they've kind of had another go. I think so. There's lots of things that are going to be up in the air, aren't there? With everything else, but everyone else, when in the meetings that I watched for Portsmouth City Council and for Havant Borough Council, the conversations essentially were, I mean, I'm paraphrasing Steve Pitt here. We don't really have a choice, but if we there is no do nothing option. We need to do something so that we at least have some sort of control of choice, and therefore some ability to kind of shape what happens. But essentially, it's happening. Our choice is: do we want to be in it from the beginning, or do we want to be left with what's left? Is that kind of your sense of?
I think that's probably right. Yes, I think the government said if you apply early, you'll get some advantages in the way the process will work. It's still an incredibly tight timetable to be doing reorganisation of this sort of scale, but you get some advantages. And so, yes, the government does set direction. Looking back at the 1970s, 71, 72, the government set very clear direction about the way they wanted to go. And despite the fact that some local authority areas and MPs didn't like it, the government said, this is the way we're going, and that's what governments do. So in a sense, yeah, you have to run with it. And I think there are potential advantages to having some sort of overall government reorganisation, I think, partly because of what I said earlier about the difficulty that local authorities can find themselves in, but also you could argue that the sort of area that I mentioned, having Fareham, Gosport and Portsmouth, doesn't have some sense to it. It makes sense. And if you're looking to try and make local government more efficient, why do you need 3 chief executives and 4 heads of personnel, 4 chief executives? You could actually make savings at that level, but also you could maybe get some efficiencies in the way services are operated. It's not only about that, of course, because clearly amalgamating these authorities is going to be a challenging task as well. There is potential there for that. And of course, if you're a councillor in Havant, Fareham and Gosport, currently you don't have a say over things like education or social care, whereas if you become part of a broader unitary, you then make those decisions directly, which you didn't have a chance to do before. So if you're an elected councillor in Havant, Fareham and Gosport, you'll actually get more opportunity to have a say if you become part of a larger unitary.
Yeah, and I guess, Graham, that's one of the things when we play with numbers. Obviously, currently, Portsmouth has 42 councillors because that's the answer to the universe. And if we look at Havant, Fareham and Gosport, but if you add their local councillors and their county councillors together, you're well over 100 there. So I guess is there a risk in this that either we've kind of drawn the boundaries here speculatively, but at the moment in that area there are 150 local representatives. I can't see the show will have to be 3 hours long to cover, and I fear for you as a local councillor that you may have to take bedding or surely there's got to be a reduction in that number. And I guess that's then that double-edged sword, isn't it, about influence and representation?
I mean, I think if you look at the number of councillors we've got now, and I think you said you'd included Havant, Gosport and Fareham's county councillors within that. Well, I think you could discount those because as that local authority will no longer exist, we won't need those councillors. So I think you can say that the current councillors that represent the wards in their local councils in Havant will do that, but the county councillor won't. I think you'll lose at least one per ward on that basis. There is no indication yet about what will happen in regard to the wards that currently exist, whether there's going to be any organisation. The difficulty we have in Portsmouth, you'll probably be aware that we have a boundary review going on looking at Portsmouth wards, because we haven't had our boundaries reviewed for 20 odd years, and so the wards are quite out of kilter in the numbers of people in them. So Charles Dickens has over 14,000 electors, but my ward, St Jude, which I represent, has got 9,000. So there's a huge imbalance. But there's now a question about whether it's sensible to reorganise the ward boundaries and have an all-out election for the Portsmouth Council when there's a possibility that may not exist in a couple of years' time. Yeah, because So the City Council have spoken to the Boundary Commission about this, but they're still digesting what the implications of the government white paper are and haven't made a decision yet. But I think Portsmouth City Councils are probably of the view that it's not a good use of time to redo the boundaries. We're not increasing the number of councils, by the way. We're just keeping the same number, but redoing the boundaries. When there may well be an all-out election in a year or two's time after that. So we'll have to wait and see. We don't know the answer yet. We'll wait and see.
It does kind of, and I'd say it seems there's an irony in an attempt to reduce bureaucracy and an attempt to improve democracy. In the interim, there seems to be anything but. It seems to have, you've kind of got the worst of both worlds until actually everything's set on a course. Is that fair? Is that?
Well, of course, the boundary review started before the government made its intention absolutely clear. So the Boundary Commission probably didn't know that. We didn't know that. I think if we'd known that in advance, I think there would have been discussions to say, well, hang on, do we need to go ahead with this? But we're partway through the exercise. The question is, do we just pause it, stop it completely, or whatever? And that's not a decision we can take. We have to talk to the Local Government Boundary Commission, and they will have to come to a decision. And I suspect there'll be some discussions at ministerial level. Because the other thing that's happening, as you may be aware, is that there would normally be Hampshire County Council elections this year.
Yes.
But obviously, if the decision is made to go for a mayoral authority and that is accepted, then the county council will effectively cease to exist. So the argument is, why would you have an election for an authority that is actually going to be
That's about to be disbanded.
What you do is you just have an extension of their time scale. Like we did during COVID, when we didn't have elections in COVID, so we extended people's timescales just to see to the end, because it seems silly to hold an all-out election when they're only going to be there for possibly a year. So that's the other thing.
Yeah, and that to be fair, that was kind of something that in the meetings seemed to get quite a lot of heat, because in Portsmouth, and forgive me if I've misunderstood how the meeting went, the message seemed to be that they wanted to ask Hampshire not to postpone their elections by long. But in Hampshire, what they were saying was, well, the discussion that took place in their chamber was essentially we should postpone our elections, or we should consider postponing our elections because of this. There's no point in having them. But then there were also people that were saying, well, I was never elected with a mandate to disband this authority, and I was never elected with a mandate to serve for a term of 5 years, so I will be standing down. I guess is that kind of fair, that there's is there that kind of level of difference across different authorities? And this seems to be across different parties. There's no one particular party that's folding their arms and saying, no, up with this I shall not put. There's
I mean, if somebody had intended to stand down at the county elections in May, for example, and had got other plans, then presumably that they will continue to do that, and that could happen anyway. And that member can stand down at any point. Whether there will be a by-election or not, I don't know. Probably not, actually. There are certain rules about by-elections where people can call them, but I'm not absolutely au fait with all the legislation. But in order to postpone the county elections, the government has to meet a certain timetable in order to put an order before Parliament.
Right.
So that's what's been a bit of a rush in getting the proposal in by the 10th of January, because there's timetables to meet. If they get accepted, then to delay the elections. I don't know enough of the details to know whether if somebody resigned subsequent to that or at the May, the supposed May election, would there be a by-election? I don't know.
That might be for them.
There would be, because possibly there would be, because then if you think about it, there would be no one holding that position for a whole year potentially. So I expect there would be a by-election in those terms. That's my assumption.
And I think the timetable is quite interesting, isn't it, Graham? Because if we look at it, I think the proposal on the table at the moment, as much as we know it, is the sort of mayoral elections in May 26. But the document I saw said that the new super unitary authorities would look like May 27. So it that's when the sort of elections would be held, which almost feels a little bit like, if the county elections don't happen in 25, the mayoral elections happen in 26, but there's almost an element of that top tier then doesn't join up. If you're in, let's say it's Havant for instance, you keep the councillor you've got for an extra year, your Hampshire County councillor, then you almost have a year where you're in that sort of no man's land between Hampshire not existing but not being part of a new unitary authority until May 27. So it does look like it's going to be quite a confused landscape for the next couple of years.
I mean, quite how these things join up is the detail which we haven't quite had yet. And I can see why, you're raising that, because it is potentially a problem. How does this quite hold up? I mean, you've got to have an elected mayor, because the elected mayor will shape the new authority. So you can't really set up the authority without them there. So that's why there's the election then. Because the other thing is that counties, of course, have elections once every 4 years, whereas the district councils have elections by thirds, so usually by thirds. So you have annual elections, so there's not so much of an issue. You could have had an election maybe for one councillor if it was a thirds, but because it's the whole authority, that's another reason why they've postponed them, because it's once every 4 years, and that's another reason why they postpone the county elections, or they would postpone them if they get to proceed with the deal.
So
but yes, there are some unanswered questions about those gaps and how we deal with them.
Yeah, and I guess they can't create that. I'm just imagining someone with a great big Gantt chart on a wall. They can't create all of those dependencies until they figure out who's going to be doing what and who they're accepting to what, and then they start kind of filling in the blanks, which then kind of makes some of the decisions. But just trying to kind of think of, so I mean, Portsmouth City Council they're currently exploring about whether to do away with their existing civic offices and whether to move to another location, and whether that would be better because the existing building is old and is much more space than they actually need now. What happens to kind of things like that? Does that, because there's obviously no point in buying or building a new building if you're just about to not need one, but also how would you then shape the local provision of services in a larger unitary authority or in a combined authority?
The answer to the first question about the civic offices, I mean, the work will continue because there isn't a plan to move or get new offices at this stage. There's still a lot of development work to do about what we do with the existing building and how any new scenario around offices would happen. So there's still a lot of detail, but that will now have to be factored in as a feature of what do we need to do because of that, so we need to think about that as well. So that will be part of it. But as I say, I don't think any civic office changes will be happening in the next couple of years for various reasons.
No.
Yeah, and I guess if we move on to the grubby subject of money, Graham, I think you touched on it. Hampshire County Council, 100+ million deficit. Southampton, similar sort of numbers. Portsmouth has worked very hard, and I always balanced from a political landscape that the councils work very hard to try and manage their budgets. But I guess when I look at this through the lens of local government reorganisation and we talk about savings, I had the joy of spending most of my career in the pharma industry, where takeovers, mergers and acquisitions were then followed by a period of absolute brutality where, reorganisation, right sizing of the organisation and other terms like that basically means an awful lot of lost jobs. Surely that is the only or one of the major routes to savings. We've got lots of buildings, I'm not saying that councillors aren't great value, but as you say, in some of that back office side of, human resources, finance, this feels like an epic task. And to be honest, radical reorganisation driven by significant job losses, this doesn't feel like a very Labour thing to do.
Well, I think you're right about the things like back office costs. I think I mentioned earlier that, if you have 4 councils with 4 heads of personnel, you don't need 4 heads of personnel. So there will be some loss of jobs probably around senior management level because, and I have to say chief executives, we have, chief executives for authorities. You don't need 4 chief executives. So there will be some loss of jobs there. It's not clear immediately that there will be any significant job losses within the individual local authorities, because clearly you still have to run the services. You'll need people to do stuff, and I think it'll take a while to work out where there might be efficiencies to be had and whether that would involve job losses or not. So I don't think that there will be immediate significant job losses within the local authorities, as far as I can see.
So I mean that just kind of leads me to think of, ask the question of where because obviously these changes are going to cost money to actually implement in the first place. So is there, how much money is there available from government to drive that change before the cost savings can actually be realised? That it just kind of feels, am I wrong to kind of miss that? Is that?
They haven't specified how much money is going to be available for the transition, but they have said that those local authorities that, if you like, go in the first tranche, go in the first wave, will get support for the development of the new authorities. But we don't know exactly how much that is yet, and what it will cover. So we have to wait and see. But clearly, I think it would be unreasonable for government to expect local authorities to pick up all of those costs just from within their existing spending, because it just would be really, really difficult. It is going to be a very challenging and difficult time for people in local authorities because there's an awful lot to do. It took something like 2 years between the legislation in 1972 and the creation of the new authorities in 74, and that was just transferring some of the functions away from, like, the city of Portsmouth to the county, and that took 2 years. So I mean, I wasn't obviously involved in politics, that I was way too young.
Oh, definitely.
But if it took 2 years to do that, I mean, maybe we've got better at doing these things. I don't know. Some of the timetables for change, I mean, I think Northamptonshire, if I remember correctly, they were split into 2 unitaries, and it took them something like 4 years to sort out the property issues from the legacy county council and who was going to get what where. Now, I don't think it needs to take that long. That maybe is an exception, but there was an awful lot of work to do. I suppose I was thinking the other day that on the positive side, Portsmouth as a city will potentially, well, the new unity authority will have a better council tax base than Portsmouth City currently has, because there's something like 80% of the homes in Portsmouth are in council tax bands A to C, which are the 3 lowest bands. So we don't raise as much council tax for the number of homes that a comparable authority would do if they have a better spread of council tax bands.
Well, they have more properties in band D, you mean? Is that?
So they may have more properties in
Right.
bands, C, D, E, or whatever. Because band D is always seen as the average council tax. Whenever the press or government talk about council tax rises, but we're always in that lower end. So we don't raise as much money from our council tax as other local authorities. And that's a historic thing because of those smaller properties. So with the unity authority covering a much larger area, it would change the balance. I haven't obviously looked at all the figures, but it would certainly move us away from being, concentrated in those lower bands. Although, of course, there will be some lower band properties in Gosport, and probably haven't too, but not to the extent I think that we've got now. So potentially, our council tax base could be a bit better in the wider unity authority.
I guess if we a little bit parochial here, Graham. So forgive me, I'm playing the part of the parochial Portsmouthian. The Portsmouth Authority, Portsmouth City Council have run their budget really well and have got some fairly significant assets. They've invested wisely. They own Lakeside. They own the port. And am I overstretching to say those things have been bought with Portsmouth council taxpayers' money? And I guess if I'm being cynical, and that's not like me, I can understand Hampshire and Southampton running to have their debts written off and everything to be back to a level playing field. But Portsmouth is in relatively good financial shape. So is it too soon to ask, well, what happens there? Is the rest of Hampshire going to get their hands on the treasure trove that the Portsmouth City Council have put aside to protect the people of Portsmouth?
I don't think so. No, I mean, the assets that we have, the port, Lakeside, whatever else, is owned by Portsmouth City Council, is not going to change hands, and Hampshire County Council aren't going to get any of it. I mean, what's going to happen to Hampshire's assets is they're going to be redistributed around the new unitary authorities, whatever they may be. So if we have assets in Portsmouth, which are Hampshire County Council ones, I don't know if we do own any, or if they do own any of that in our city, then we might have those. Of course, they might not be particularly useful assets or particularly well kept, so that might be a problem. But we probably dispose of them in those cases. So I don't think there's any danger of us losing the income from, or losing our assets, as you suggest.
So the elected mayor couldn't decide at some point to say, actually, we don't need two ports. We'll get rid of Portsmouth Port, for example.
No. The elected mayor wouldn't have the power to do that. I mean, what they would do, presumably, is seek to improve maybe transport links or to do what they could to secure investment for the port. I mean, we may well, because they're involved in economic development and regeneration, we might get some support for investment in the port. Again, this is all up for discussion because we haven't got the mayor, we haven't got a budget, we don't know what we are. But one would imagine that the mayor is there to promote the economic development and well-being of the whole of their area, and that includes Portsmouth. And if we're doing well, then they're doing well.
So what
they have an incentive to support us.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things the leader of Portsmouth City Council, Steve Pitt, talks about at the recent kind of local government settlement was that it was only for a year. Is there, does the green paper or the white paper, sorry, I get lost track on what colour the paper is now. Does that talk more about actual multi-year kind of settlements financially so that councils, so the unitaries that are then formed are able to make better decisions rather than just fighting with firefighting all the time?
I mean, as I understand it, the government have said two things about that. One is they said that they would only be able to give a 1 year settlement this year because of the financial position the government found itself in. But they have committed to what they call multi-year settlements in future years. They've also committed to revising effectively the government formula by which local authorities get money. Because I think they feel that it hasn't been fairer to those poorer authorities. If you look at the period from, say, 2010 onwards, particularly during the period of austerity up to 2015 and 2018, 20, excuse me, many of the poorer, larger urban areas lost out. And I think the Labour government has said that they want to relook at that. And since we have some quite high levels of deprivation in parts of our city, I think there is potential that we could benefit from that, given that what I said earlier about our low council tax base. They do take these into account. They do notice that we have a low council tax base and therefore aren't able to raise as much money as other local authorities. So we have to hope that any new system, and the previous government did actually talk about a fair funding formula, but the work stopped a couple of years ago. They just never took it any further. I think they're proposing to take that forward and come up with a better funding formula, but we'll also have to see what the detail is, because the devil, as they always say, is in the detail.
Because a lot of council expenditure are obligations, like adult social care, child social care, but those things aren't then directly funded by, although they get a grant from central government. Is that right? They're not those line items, for example, in the budget aren't directly funded by central government. So the central government is saying you must pay for this type of care to these standards, to these different demographics, but the funding for it doesn't actually follow the instruction, does it? Is that something that could change?
One of the complaints people have had in local government is that governments, and this is governments of all different political colours, have tended to put responsibilities onto local councils. So you must do this, you must do that, but not actually provide the funding for it. And this goes back, 20, 30 years and beyond. So it's always been a complaint of local government. Not unjustified, I have to say. It is justified. But government have obviously given money to local authority directly to try and help with adult social care because of the sheer pressure of demand. But they've also allowed councils to raise council tax specifically for adult social care. An element of council tax is always, if you like, earmarked for that, so that people can identify what we're using it for. So it's a combination of some government money, but also local taxpayers being asked to pay for it as well.
Brilliant. So thank you for trying. We've been casting the runes and staring into them to try and understand there. I guess just to kind of close this out, what happens next, Graham? And when do we have any indication or of any kind of timeline of when we might know more? Because I think we've covered an awful lot of ground in this episode, but it feels like there might be a few more episodes to come, even if we don't get to cover elections for the next couple of years. It feels like this is going to occupy a fair bit of airtime.
I think this is going to take up a lot of local authority officer and member time, yes, over the next years. The next things are, I suppose, whether the bid that Hampshire put in has been accepted, and then where we sit in the queue. Are they going to accept all the bids? Are they going to accept some of the bids? We don't know what the criteria is. If they accept a lot of the bids, are we all going to run at the same pace? Lots of questions there. The other question is looking at local government reorganisation. We haven't received the criteria for how we should create a new unitary authority. What criteria do we need to apply to create this new unitary authority? Until we've got that, we can't really start doing any work. And I understand that the government are supposed to give us this information by the end of the month. So this will be next week. Hopefully we will know more. It might be the 31st of January before we know, but
we'll watch this space then.
With anticipation. And then discussions can start in earnest between the local authorities about what we may want to do.
And I guess with something like this, the unknown is probably key, isn't it? So just give us a flavour from, obviously, Portsmouth councillors had sat around. We saw some of the meeting, some language used about shotgun weddings. How would you say the general mood is within the Portsmouth councillors and with your colleagues on the Labour group about how this looks for the future?
I mean, clearly there's a deal of uncertainty, and there are important questions that we do need some answers to. And the sooner we can get those, the better. I mean, I'm probably a half glass full man rather than a half glass empty man, and I think the potential for devolving powers to the rest of England, and including Hampshire in that part, is a good move. We might not like the mayoral model, but the trouble is, once that model has been in operation for a number of years, as it has been, that is the model it's going to be, and we need to make the best of it. I suppose in looking at the local government reorganisation, I think there are some potential benefits, because if you have a new, larger unitary authority, there's plenty of scope, in my view, to devolve powers within that. The Portsmouth City Council Constitution currently has the option for some sort of area governance. And we've never implemented that because nobody's really been interested in doing it. But there's plenty of opportunity, I think, if we think about it carefully enough, that we could devolve decision-making down into the constituent areas of any unitary authority and give local councils there the opportunity to make some decisions themselves rather than having everything done centrally through a cabinet. Now, that's my particular personal view of it. How it will develop, of course, is another matter. I'd certainly argue that's a good way forward, because it means that there's more involvement, probably decisions are better made, sometimes more locally than others. I suspect, although I'm a transport spokesman for the Labour group, I know quite a lot about Portsmouth. I don't try and know as much about Gosport, so maybe Gosport people should make their decisions over there about transport issues, or at least some of them anyway. So that's what I mean in terms of how you can make things a bit better possible. But yes, lots of questions and some uncertainties.
And I think that's probably a great summary on which to close the podcast. So you've been listening to the Pompey Politics podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And our guest today has been Cllr Graham Heaney. Thanks for coming back on, Graham, and making sense of it for us. And I've been Simon Sansbury. Do join us next week at 6:27 on Sunday, when we'll have another episode looking into some other policies and processes in local government, and trying to make sense of them as well. And who knows what news we might have on this subject by then. So see you next week. Don't forget to like, follow and comment on Facebook, or comment and subscribe on YouTube. Find us on all the social media platforms: Facebook, X, YouTube, Threads, LinkedIn.